A resolution to encourage breastfeeding was expected to be approved quickly and easily by the hundreds of government delegates who gathered this spring in Geneva for the United Nations-affiliated World Health Assembly. Based on decades of research, the resolution says that mother's milk is healthiest for children and countries should strive to limit the inaccurate or misleading marketing of breast milk substitutes. A mother unable to nurse feeds her child donated milk. The Trump administration used threats of trade sanctions and withdrawal of military aid to try to block a measure at the World Health Assembly that encouraged breastfeeding. James Estrin, The New York Times, then the U.S. delegation, embracing the interests of infant formula manufacturers, appended the deliberations. American officials sought to water down the resolution by removing language that called on governments to protect, promote and support breastfeeding, and another passage that called on policymakers to restrict the promotion of food products many experts say can have deleterious effects on young children. When that failed, they turned to threats, according to diplomats and government officials who took part in the discussions. Ecuador, which had planned to introduce the measure, was the first to find itself in the crosshairs. Article continued below. The Americans were blunt. If Ecuador refused to drop the resolution, Washington would unleash punishing trade measures and withdraw crucial military aid. The Ecuadorian government quickly acquiesced. The showdown over the issue was recounted by more than a dozen participants from several countries, many of whom requested anonymity because they feared retaliation from the United States. Health advocates scrambled to find another sponsor for the resolution, but at least a dozen countries, most of them poor nations in Africa and Latin America, backed off, citing fears of retaliation. According to officials from Uruguay, Mexico and the United States, "We were astonished, appalled, and also saddened," said Patty Rundle, policy director of the British advocacy group Baby Milk Action, who has attended meetings of the Assembly, the decision-making body of the World Health Organization, since the late 1980s. What happened was tantamount to blackmail, with the U.S. holding the world hostage and trying to overturn nearly 40 years of consensus on best way to protect infant and young child health, she said. In the end, the Americans' efforts were mostly unsuccessful. It was the Russians who ultimately stepped in to introduce the measure, and the Americans did not threaten them. The intensity of the administration's opposition to the breastfeeding resolution stunned public health officials and foreign diplomats, who described it as a marked contrast to the Obama administration, which largely supported whose long-standing policy of encouraging breastfeeding. Article continued below. During the deliberations, some American delegates even suggested the United States might cut its contribution to the WHO, several negotiators said. Washington is the single largest contributor to the health organization, providing $845 million, or roughly 15% of its budget last year. The confrontation was the latest example of the Trump administration siding with corporate interests on numerous public health and environmental issues. The Americans also sought, unsuccessfully, to thwart a WHO effort aimed at helping poor countries obtain access to life-saving medicines. Washington, supporting the pharmaceutical industry, has long resisted calls to modify patent laws as a way of increasing drug availability in the developing world, but health advocates say the Trump administration has ratcheted up its opposition to such efforts.